Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling gender equality.
Oh, a big one.
Yeah, and you've given us some fascinating material to work with.
Yeah.
We've got legal theories, international agreements, even a peek into the Ethiopian constitution.
Oh, wow.
So we really try to explore what true equality means, how different approaches try to achieve it, and maybe even uncover some surprises along the way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, we often talk about equality in very abstract terms, but, it has very real consequences for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into all these different approaches, can we just start with the basics?
Yeah.
What do we even mean by gender equality?
Right. So at its core, gender equality really means that all genders have equal value and should have equal access to resources and opportunities.
Okay.
So things like healthcare, education, jobs, even just feeling safe in your community.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But, the material that you sent also talks about gender inequality. And they make this point that it's not about biological differences between men and women, but it's about how society treats them differently.
Yeah, and we call those things social constructs.
Okay.
These can be, things like stereotypes or how genders are portrayed in the media or even just plain sexism. And those things create disadvantages that really limit choices for people and hold them back from reaching their full potential.
Yeah, and some of the examples that you gave were really powerful. Like in some places, women have a harder time accessing healthcare. Or you're getting certain jobs just because they're women.
Exactly.
So how do we fix this?
Yeah.
What are the solutions?
Well, there are a lot of different ideas about how to achieve gender equality.
Okay.
And one of the first ones that comes up is this idea of formal equality. And formal equality, sometimes called the equal treatment of likes,
Okay.
basically argues that everyone should be treated the same regardless of gender.
Okay, but on the surface, that sounds fair. But then, in the material, it brings up some pretty thought-provoking criticisms.
Yeah.
Like, what if everyone is being treated equally, but they're all being treated badly? Is that really equality?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And can we really just ignore the fact that people have different needs and face different obstacles?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes applying the same rules to everybody can actually backfire.
Okay.
And, one of the examples the material brings up is this city in the U.S. that closed all its public pools to avoid having to integrate them racially.
Wow, that's a pretty extreme example of how, sticking to equal treatment can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
It makes you think, is there a better approach?
Well, there's this idea of substantive equality.
Yeah.
So instead of just focusing on treating everyone the same, substantive equality tries to level the playing field by taking into account past disadvantages.
So it's kind of like recognizing that some people might need a little bit of extra support to have a real shot at the same opportunities.
Exactly. So substantive equality considers things like historical context or biological differences, like the need for maternity leave or the social barriers that hold certain genders back.
But even with this approach, there must be challenges, right?
Yeah.
I mean, trying to correct for past inequality seems like it could get really complex.
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely potential downsides.
Okay.
Substantive equality can be more expensive to implement.
Right.
And the positive effects might take longer to show up. So it's a complex issue.
Okay, so we've got these two main ways of thinking about equality.
Yeah.
But then the material you sent also brought up these feminist legal theories. And to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what that actually means.
Okay, well, simply put, feminism is the belief that women should have equal rights. But over time, the feminist movement has grown to encompass all spheres of life, not just legal rights.
Okay, so how does that translate to the law?
So feminist legal theory really examines how laws can contribute to gender inequality and then pushes for changes to get rid of those discriminatory structures.
One thing I found really fascinating was this idea of the personal is political.
Right.
The materials talk about how sharing personal stories is a powerful way to expose injustice and push for legal reform.
Yeah, it's about using lived experiences to show how these abstract legal concepts actually play out in people's lives. It brings those dry legal terms to life.
It makes you wonder, are there any other ways that feminists are looking at the law?
Yeah, so the materials you send highlight 4 key approaches.
Right.
The first one, you've got the equality model. So this model pushes for equal treatment under the law, either by applying existing principles more consistently or by changing legal categories altogether to acknowledge gender.
Okay, so what about the second approach?
The second approach is the sexual difference model. It recognizes that, yes, there are biological differences between men and women, and it argues that the law should consider those differences.
Okay, I can see how that could be important for things like, maternity leave policies or laws that specifically address violence against women.
Exactly.
What about the third approach? This one sounds a little bit more intense.
So the third one is called the dominance model.
Oh, okay.
And it takes a more critical look at the legal system itself. It argues that historically, laws have often been created in a way that benefits men and maintains their power over women.
So it's not just about individual laws being unfair, it's about the entire system being skewed.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this dominance model adds a whole new layer to the discussion.
Yeah.
So what's the final approach?
So the fourth approach is called the anti-essentialist model, also known as intersectionality.
Okay.
And this one challenges the idea that there's a single universal woman's experience.
Right, women aren't a monolithic group.
Yeah.
I can see how factors like race or class, sexual orientation, all these different parts of a person's identity could intersect with their gender and create very different experiences.
Precisely. So the anti-essentialist model pushes us to go beyond simple categories and really grapple with the complexities of how various forms of inequality can overlap and compound each other.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different ways of thinking about gender equality, but how does all this play out in the real world?
Right.
These are big concepts, but how are they actually being put into practice?
Well, that's where international legal instruments come into play.
Okay.
So these are agreements between countries that set standards for how they should address gender equality within their own borders.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a global effort to tackle these issues.
Exactly. And the sources you sent highlight a bunch of these documents, like the International Bill of Human Rights, which is kind of like a universal declaration of basic human rights for everyone.
Okay.
Then there's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW for short,
Okay.
which specifically focuses on women's rights. And there's also the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
It sounds like these documents are trying to create like a global framework for addressing gender inequality.
Exactly. And instead of getting bogged down in the details of each document,
Right.
let's focus on some key takeaways.
Right.
For example, CEDAW recognizes both formal and substantive equality.
Wait, how does that work? I thought those approaches kind of contradict each other.
Well, it's definitely a balancing act.
Okay.
So Article 2 of CEDAW says that discrimination based on gender is prohibited. That's the formal equality part.
Okay.
But Article 4 says it's okay for countries to take special measures, sometimes called affirmative action, to help women overcome past disadvantages.
Oh, okay. So that's where the substantive equality comes in.
Exactly.
So it's about creating a level playing field, even if that means treating people differently to get there.
You got it. And what's really interesting is that CEDAW also pays special attention to the rights of rural women. Article 14 specifically addresses their unique challenges.
That makes sense. I mean, we were just talking about how different aspects of a person's identity can intersect
Right.
and create unique experiences of inequality.
Yeah.
So I bet women in rural areas face a whole different set of barriers compared to women in urban areas.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've gone from these high-level theories to this global perspective.
Yeah.
But now I'm curious to see how all of this plays out in a specific country.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in Ethiopia.
Yes, Ethiopia.
Ah.
And what's fascinating is that the Ethiopian constitution, which is like the supreme law of the land, actually incorporates elements of both formal and substantive equality.
Really? Can you give me an example?
Sure. So Article 25 of the Ethiopian constitution guarantees equal protection under the law for everyone regardless of gender.
Right.
That's straight up formal equality. But then Article 35 recognizes that historically, women in Ethiopia have faced significant disadvantages. So it allows for affirmative action policies to help level the playing field and give women a fair shot at competing for resources and opportunities.
So it's like they're trying to find that balance between ensuring equal treatment for everyone while also acknowledging that sometimes you need to take extra steps to address past injustices.
Exactly. And this balancing act is something we see reflected in international agreements, national laws.
Okay.
And even in everyday conversations about how to achieve gender equality, it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
But it's one that's worth grappling with if we want to create a fairer and more just world.
Wow. This has been a lot to process.
Yeah.
We've gone from defining gender equality to exploring all these different theoretical approaches, zoomed out to see how international agreements are tackling these issues,
Right.
and then zoomed back in to see how it all plays out in the Ethiopian constitution.
It's a lot.
Yeah. And it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
There's so much more to explore, especially when we start looking at like the real life stories of people who experience gender inequality firsthand.
Absolutely.
So that's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, I can't wait.
We're going to hear some personal narratives that really bring these concepts to life.
Right.
And show how gender inequality plays out in people's everyday lives.
He's a good kid.
So get ready for some powerful stories and insights. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into gender equality.
Awesome.
So in part 1, we explored these different theories about how to achieve gender equality, and we even looked at how countries are trying to address these issues, like on a global scale.
And it's interesting to see how those kind of abstract ideas about formal and substantive equality, actually show up in real world laws and policies.
Yeah, like how the Ethiopian constitution tries to strike that balance between, guaranteeing equal rights for everyone, but then also taking those extra steps to try to help overcome past disadvantages.
Yeah. It's a tough question, right? How do you create a truly level playing field when, not everybody starts from the same place?
And how do we even know if the playing field is level? Like, are there times when those extra measures like affirmative action go too far?
It's a good question, and it really kind of highlights the limits of just relying on laws to achieve gender equality.
Totally, because laws can only go so far right.
Exactly.
They can set the rules, but they can't change people's, hearts and minds.
Yeah, you can't legislate attitudes.
Right. And that's why it's so important to look beyond just the legal stuff and think about, the broader cultural context.
For sure.
Because true gender equality requires us to challenge, those deeply ingrained social norms and beliefs.
Absolutely.
He's like, the law can create the space for equality, but then it's up to society to actually make it happen.
I like that. Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those personal narratives that we were talking about.
Right.
What kind of stories are we talking about here?
So imagine hearing from a woman who, despite having the same qualifications as her male colleagues, is repeatedly passed over for promotions, because she's told she doesn't have the right leadership style. Or man who was mocked by his friends and family for wanting to stay home and care for his children instead of pursuing a traditional career.
Or a transgender individual who struggled to find a job where they felt safe and respected because potential employers couldn't see past their gender identity.
Yeah.
These stories really bring it home, don't they? Gender inequality isn't just this abstract concept. It has real consequences for people's lives, their relationships, their careers, their sense of self-worth.
And sometimes those personal narratives can reveal these subtle forms of discrimination that we might not even notice in our everyday lives, like microaggressions or unconscious biases that can make it harder for certain genders to succeed.
Thinking about this makes me wonder, do men ever experience gender inequality?
That's a great question. And it's really important to acknowledge that gender inequality can impact everyone, not just women.
Right. It's those rigid gender roles and expectations can be a trap for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Men might feel this pressure to be the breadwinner.
For sure.
Or to suppress their emotions, and that can have really negative consequences too.
Absolutely. And this is where that anti-essentialist model we talked about, that intersectionality piece, becomes really relevant.
Okay.
Because it reminds us that gender inequality isn't just this men versus women thing.
Right.
It's about recognizing the complex ways in which gender intersects with other aspects of a person's identity, like race, class, sexual orientation, and so on.
So it's not just about one group being better or worse off than another.
Right.
It's about understanding how all these different forms of inequality can overlap.
Yeah.
And create these unique experiences of privilege and oppression.
Exactly.
And those personal narratives can help us see those intersections more clearly.
Yeah.
They can show us how, a black woman might face different challenges than a white woman, or how a gay man might experience gender norms differently than a straight man.
For sure. It's all about nuance.
Yeah, it's by listening to these stories, we start to develop a more nuanced understanding of how gender inequality actually plays out in the real world. It's not just theoretical concepts, it's people's lives.
And I think that's what makes these personal narratives so powerful. They can help us build empathy,
Yeah.
challenge our assumptions, and ultimately inspire us to work towards a more just and equitable world.
So we've talked about the power of these personal narratives, but how do we actually make sure those stories are heard? Like, it's one thing to share your story with your friends and family,
Right.
but how do you get it out there to a wider audience?
That's where things like social media journalism and even art can play a really important role.
So it's about using those platforms to amplify those voices and make sure those experiences are seen and heard.
Exactly. And it can be really powerful because when people see themselves reflected in those stories,
Yeah.
it can validate their experiences and make them feel less alone.
It's like those personal narratives can create a sense of community and solidarity. Right?
Absolutely.
They can show people that they're not the only ones struggling with these issues.
Exactly. And that can be a really powerful catalyst for change.
But it's not just about sharing those stories, is it?
Yeah.
It's also about listening to those stories.
Yes.
With an open heart and an open mind.
100%. Because real change starts with understanding. And to really understand the complexities of gender inequality, we need to be willing to listen to the experiences of others, even when those experiences are different from our own.
It's about stepping outside our own bubbles and trying to see the world through someone else's eyes.
Exactly. And that can be challenging.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly rewarding because when we open ourselves up to those different perspectives, we expand our own understanding of the world and become more equipped to create positive change.
So listening to those personal narratives is like the first step towards building a more just and equitable world.
I think so, because when we understand the human impact of gender inequality, it becomes much harder to ignore. It motivates us to act, to challenge the status quo, and to fight for a world where everyone can thrive, regardless of their gender.
This conversation has really shifted my perspective.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how these personal narratives aren't just like interesting stories.
Right.
They're essential tools for understanding and addressing gender inequality.
I agree. They're like the missing piece of the puzzle. We can talk about theories and laws all day long,
Right.
but it's those human stories that really bring the issue to life and make it impossible to ignore.
So what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to explore how those personal narratives are actually being used to advocate for change. Because it's one thing to tell your story,
Okay.
but it's another thing to use that story to actually make a difference in the world.
So it's about turning those experiences into action, like using those stories to push for policy changes or challenge discriminatory practices or raise awareness about the issues.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at some specific examples of how individuals and organizations are using personal narratives to make a real impact in the fight for gender equality.
Ooh, I'm really looking forward to that. It's exciting to think about how these personal stories can be transformed into like powerful tools for change.
It's about harnessing the power of storytelling to create a more just and equitable world. And that's a goal we're striving for.
Absolutely. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into gender equality, where we'll explore the transformative power of personal narratives and how they're being used to drive real change. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into gender equality. And I'm really excited about this part because we're going to actually see how those personal stories that we've been talking about are being used to, create real change in the world.
Yeah, I think this is where it gets really inspiring. Because it's one thing to understand, the theories and the laws, but it's quite another to actually see people taking action and making a difference.
Right. In the last two parts, we've talked about all these different approaches to gender equality. We looked at international agreements. We even zoomed in on Ethiopia's constitution. But now I think it's time to bring it all home.
Yeah.
And connect it back to the lived experiences of individuals.
Because ultimately, the fight for gender equality isn't about abstract concepts. It's about real people's lives.
So how are these personal narratives being used to advocate for change? Can you give me some concrete examples?
Absolutely. One really powerful example is the #MeToo movement. This movement used personal stories of sexual harassment and assault to shine a light on a problem that had been silenced for far too long.
Yeah, I remember when that movement took off. It felt like a real turning point. Suddenly people were sharing their experiences and finding strength in numbers.
Exactly. And by sharing their stories, survivors of sexual harassment and assault were able to challenge the culture of silence and actually hold perpetrators accountable.
It's amazing how those personal narratives can create such a powerful wave of change.
And it's not just about large-scale movements like #MeToo. individual stories can also have a huge impact.
Yep.
For example, the materials you sent mention Malala Yousafzai,
Oh, yeah.
who was shot by the Taliban for speaking out in favor of girls' education.
Malala's story is so incredible. She risked her life to advocate for something she believed in.
Yeah,
And her courage has inspired millions of people around the world.
exactly. And her personal narrative, became this powerful symbol of the importance of education for girls, and it helped to galvanize support for her cause.
It makes you realize that sometimes a single story can really change the world.
Absolutely. And, those stories don't always have to be about dramatic events or famous people.
Right.
Sometimes the most impactful stories are the ones that come from everyday people sharing their everyday experiences.
Like what?
Well, think about someone sharing their experience of being paid less than their male colleagues for doing the same job. Or someone talking about how they were passed over for a promotion because they were pregnant.
Yeah.
Or someone sharing their struggle to be accepted as a non-binary person.
It's like those everyday stories can really make you stop and think.
Right.
Because they show how gender inequality isn't just this abstract concept. It's something that people face every single day.
Right. And by sharing those stories, people can raise awareness, challenge stereotypes, and start to shift the culture towards greater equality.
So it sounds like these personal narratives are kind of like seeds of change. They plant these ideas in people's minds, and then those ideas can grow and blossom into real action.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and I think it highlights the importance of creating spaces where people feel safe and supported to share their stories.
So it's not just about telling the stories, it's also about creating the right environment for those stories to be heard.
Exactly. And, that can involve things like fostering a culture of empathy and respect, challenging discriminatory language and behavior, and amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized or silenced.
It sounds like this is about more than just changing laws or policies. It's about changing hearts and minds.
Absolutely, because true gender equality requires a fundamental shift in how we think about gender power and justice.
This deep dive has really been a journey for me. We started with these big abstract concepts, but now I'm seeing how those concepts connect to real people's lives
Yeah.
and how those personal stories can be used to create real change.
And what's exciting is that it's an ongoing journey. The conversation around gender equality is constantly evolving, and there's always more to learn and more to do.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can they do to contribute to this movement for gender equality?
Well, I think the first step is just to be aware of the issue. Educate yourself about the different forms of gender inequality and how they manifest in your own community.
So read articles, listen to podcasts, talk to people with different experiences. Just be curious and open to learning.
Exactly.
Huh.
And once you have that awareness, you can start to take action. Speak up against sexism and discrimination when you see it. Challenge those harmful stereotypes. Support organizations and initiatives that are working to advance gender equality.
And don't be afraid to share your own stories.
Yes,
Because you never know how your experience might inspire or empower somebody else.
that's right. Every voice matters in this fight, and every action, no matter how small, can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world.
It's been really inspiring to explore this topic with you. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the complexities of gender equality and the power of these personal narratives.
Well, it's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you, and I really hope our listeners feel empowered to continue exploring this topic and to become active participants in the movement for gender equality.
Yeah, because this isn't just a women's issue. It's a human issue. And it's going to take all of us working together to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
On that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Yeah,
It's been a thought-provoking and inspiring exploration, wouldn't you say?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I hope it sparks some new ideas and some much-needed hope for our listeners. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into gender equality. Until next time.